In the last 2 hours, Merck's Ebola vaccine arrives in Congo. In the last 4 hours, experimental Ebola vaccine to be distributed in Congo. Yesterday, WHO rolls out experimental Ebola vaccine in DRC Congolese city of Mbandaka to trial experimental Ebola vaccine Congo to treat people with experimental Ebola vaccine. Early this week, DRC, experimental Ebola vaccine to be administered in Mbandaka. In the last 7 days, what we know about the Ebola outbreak, and the vaccine that might help in Ebola outbreak, an experimental vaccine is put to the test. New Ebola vaccine faces key test. Ebola vaccine could be game changer in Congo. Ebola vaccine arrives in DRC amid outbreak in Congo. Outbreak, Ebola vaccine faces reality tests. Analysis, in Congo outbreak, Ebola vaccine faces reality tests. Experimental Ebola vaccine rolled out to battle Congo outbreak. Everything you need to know about the Ebola vaccine. Can an experimental Ebola vaccine put a stop to the latest outbreak? Vaccine trial launched to stop Ebola. Congo receives first doses of Ebola vaccine as outbreak hits urban center. UN staff on way to Congo to get experimental Ebola vaccine. Ebola spreads into Congolese city as Canadian vaccine arrives. Experimental vaccine ready for use in Congo's Ebola outbreak. First doses of new Ebola vaccine reach DRC amid outbreak. Over 4,000 doses of Ebola vaccine arrive. Experimental vaccine arrives in Congo amid new Ebola outbreak. Ebola vaccine arrives in DR Congo amid outbreak. Congo aims to stop its Ebola outbreak with an experimental vaccine. DRC's health ministry says doses of Ebola vaccine arrive. Experimental Ebola vaccine arrives in Congo capital. First doses of experimental vaccine sent to Congo for Ebola outbreak. The Ebola outbreak in the DRC is about to meet a fierce weapon, a vaccine. Congo receives first doses of Ebola vaccine amid outbreak. Congo's health ministry says doses of Ebola vaccine arrive. WHO sends first doses of Ebola vaccine to Congo. Congo to deploy experimental Ebola vaccine to contain outbreak. Can the new Ebola vaccine stop the latest outbreak? Hoping to head off an epidemic, the DRC turns to experimental Ebola vaccine. Ebola vaccine headed to Congo to help contain outbreak. WHO to administer experimental Ebola vaccine after 19 die in DRC. Experimental vaccine approved for use against Ebola virus in Congo. Experimental Ebola vaccine to be used in DRC outbreak. WHO, Congo approves use of experimental Ebola vaccine. Ebola vaccine developed by Canada okayed for Congo. Experimental Ebola vaccine heads to Congo as death toll reaches 19. DRC approves use of experimental Ebola vaccine. WHO says Congo approves use of experimental Ebola vaccine. WHO says WHO allowed to use Ebola vaccine in Congo. Experimental vaccine will be used against Ebola outbreak in the DRC. WHO gets approval to use Ebola vaccine in DRC. WHO to use experimental Ebola vaccine to fight Congo outbreak. Experimental Ebola vaccine to be used in Congo's outbreak. WHO head says WHO gets approval to use Ebola vaccine in Democratic Republic of Congo. Ebola in Congo may be contained by remote location. New vaccine. WHO reports new Ebola case in DRC. Vaccine this week. WHO reports new Ebola case in DR Congo. Vaccine this week. In the last month, experimental vaccine to be used against Ebola outbreak in the DRC. WHO to use experimental Ebola vaccine. Experimental Ebola vaccine may help halt new outbreak in Congo. Video. Experimental vaccine could tackle Ebola outbreak. Ebola erupts again in Africa, only now there's a vaccine. WHO to use Ebola vaccine to stem outbreak in remote area of Congo. Ebola vaccine to stem outbreak in Congo. WHO hopes to use Ebola vaccine to stem outbreak in remote area of Congo. WHO hopes to use Ebola vaccine to stem Congo outbreak. WHO prepares for worst case Ebola scenario, hopes to deploy vaccine. Merck's Ebola vaccine offers lasting protection.